All right, folks, let's get this show on the road. So, good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you're joining us from around the world. Today, we're going to talk about the 5 must-haves of a modern disaster recovery solution. And so, just a few housekeeping items before we get going. You will get an email after today's webinar with a video recording of the webinar. So if there are parts of it you want to rewatch or if you want to share it with some of your colleagues, you'll be able to do that. If you haven't already, find the questions tool in the GoToWebinar software. We're going to be using that a lot throughout the presentation today. And just by way of introduction, I'm doing my own introduction today. My name's Ken Shaw. I'm the founder and CEO of Infrascale. Feel free to write down my email address or my Twitter handle there and get in touch with me directly. I love to talk to industry folks about what we're doing here and about the challenges you're facing in your day-to-day life. So, looking at today's agenda, we're going to cover 5 major topics. Presentation will go about 30 minutes, and then we'll do a free-form Q&A at the end. And what we're going to cover, first and foremost, are problems with traditional disaster recovery. I think this will be something that's near and dear and quite familiar to most of the folks in today's audience. Then we're going to talk through 5 must-haves of a modern disaster recovery solution, a disaster recovery solution that's appropriate for 2015, not 1995. Then I'll tell you a little bit about us here at Infrascale, what we see our mission in life is, talk about our marquee product, the Cloud Failover Appliance, and then we'll do that interactive Q&A, which is an Ask Me Anything format. And we've got a bit of a surprise for audience members, or perhaps not if you've attended one of Infrascale's webinars before. We're doing a prize giveaway at the end. So the way that works is the person who asks the most questions on topic throughout the webinar wins a Kindle. And so the way to do that is just feel free to ask a question in the AMA format. You can ask questions all throughout the webinar, and I'll get to them at the end. And we'll announce the winner at the end of the show. So without further ado, let's get into the meat of things. But what we're first going to do here is actually sort of keep this interactivity idea going. I'm going to ask you guys a question. So if you can put your pizzas down for a hot second and answer this first interactive poll. And the first poll we're asking today is just tell us about your business. How big is your company? Why do we ask this? 2 major reasons. One, it's great market research for us to find out, who's interested in disaster recovery. And 2, most importantly, to make sure the content's relevant, right? So I can see you're all voting dynamically. A lot of people in the audience today are in the 0 to 100 bucket. And then very few of you are in the 1500 plus bucket. So that'll change the examples I use. We've got about 61% of you have voted. Okay, cool. So we'll stop that there. And so the results in 65% of the audience today are in the 0 to 100 bucket. So we're with smaller organizations today. 20% of you are in 1500 plus, and then it's single-digit percentages in the other categories. Interesting. All right. So we've got kind of a U-shaped distribution. Well, the first section of the presentation is setting up the problem that we're talking about today, right? And really the purpose of this first section is to just sort of drive home the point that the traditional approach to disaster recovery isn't serving the industry well. And when I give this talk a lot, I talk about the fact that the computing industry has been wonderful at innovating and creating ways for us to create data, but really poor at innovating around ways to help us protect data. And that's a shame, because these days so much of our intellectual blood, sweat, and tears is manifested as digital files on a computer, right? 200 years ago, I'm sure my forebears used their hands to build houses or make furniture or whatever. Today, I spend my entire time at a computer, and all of my energy and effort goes into creating Word files or Excel documents or PowerPoints. And the computer industry has been phenomenal at creating different ways for me to harness my creative, energies and resolve that into binary data. But the computing industry has been awful at innovating around ways to help me protect that data. It would be like the car industry, creating cars that can go 500 miles an hour, but never creating brakes or airbags. And that's kind of how that's my metaphor for the computing industry today, where creating data has never been easier. We've never been creating more data. Data is exploding geometrically, and yet the techniques that we use to protect that data are in many cases still rooted in technology paradigms that were invented in the 70s, right? crazy. So that's the sort of the high-level problem we're going to tackle today. I'd love any of your comments along the way, so feel free to sort of use that questions tool and chime in as we go. And so let's look at some data. Virtually every business will experience some type of downtime. That we all know. But how common is it? Well, we commissioned a study recently in partnership with Actual Tech Media, a market research firm. And the graphics on this slide tell two separate stories. The first one on the left is that basically every one of you in the audience has experienced some sort of downtime in the last 2 years. In fact, if the statistics, are true in today's audience, 91% of you have experienced downtime in the last 24 months, and 47% of you have experienced it this year. But it's actually the slide, or the graphic rather, on the right-hand side of this slide that I want to draw your attention to. Because what this does is breaks down that downtime in the sample size of 300 companies we spoke to into the actual causes of that downtime. And what you'll see is that the leading cause is hardware failure, second one's human error, third one's software failure, and only 5% is natural disasters. And what I find really interesting about this is that the marketing material and the talk track in the industry for disaster recovery is always focused on macro disasters. It's floods and it's fires. And what's interesting is it's not those sort of biblical disasters that are most common. It's the micro disasters. It's the software script that inappropriately trashed a directory. It's the junior sysadmin who thought he was moving a folder, but he actually deleted the folder. It's the motherboard that dies in your ESX cluster, which takes down, 10 VMs. It's these micro failures that are far, far, far more common and actually can do incredible damage to your business. And so when I say damage to your business, what am I talking about? Well, the most obvious form in which this damage occurs is a sort of financial cost. And today's audience skews to small organizations, so I'll focus on the little sort of townhouse here. But the Aberdeen Group has quantified the cost of a single hour of complete system outage for businesses in the United States. And for a small business, their calculations come to $8,000 for an hour of a business being down. And that sounds like a lot. But I'll tell you a story. We've got a client. He's a dentist, and he's got 13 different dental practices. And he had, in one of his offices, he got the CryptoLocker virus, and the computer that ran his scheduling system for all of his offices went down. So he's a small business, right? Small dental practice with a bunch of little offices. It's not JP Morgan. He's not a Fortune 5000 business, but his entire dental network was down for 2 days. He got in touch with us, and we got him back up and running straight away. If he'd gotten in touch with us quicker, he would have been up and running quicker. So oftentimes, the hidden cost of downtime is dramatically more than we think it is. So that then sort of raises the obvious question, well, if downtime's so harsh, why haven't we done more to address it? Why haven't we, implemented systems that allow us to fail over to a second location really quickly? So that brings me to my second poll, right? And so let's actually ask the audience today, how prepared are you for such a disaster? So this second poll asks the question, when it comes to failover and disaster recovery, which of these buckets do you fit in? 1, you can fail over to a second site in under an hour. 2, gosh, I wish I could fail over to a second location, but I just can't afford it. 3, for whatever reason, I don't need that kind of failover. All right, people are voting. We've got about 45% of people voting. We'll just give that a few more minutes. And one of the things I should have mentioned on that previous slide while you're all voting is it's not just the cost to the business of downtime. It's often the cost to the individual, right? So today's audience is probably filled with IT professionals. And so you may not own your business, and therefore you may not immediately think to yourself, oh boy, what's the cost of being down? But I'll tell you what the cost of being down for you can be. It can cost you your job, right? So usually it's our neck on the line as IT professionals to keep those systems running. And so what we're going to talk about today is ways to protect your company, your organization, your team, your management, and make sure this sort of disaster, is something you don't have to worry about. The metaphorical brakes and airbags in the car I was talking about earlier. All right, we've got our survey results in, and it's interesting. So the results are this: 48% of you can fail over to a second location in an hour, which is really impressive. 44% of you say, gee, I wish I could fail over in an hour, but I just can't afford it. And then 9% of you say, for whatever reason, you don't need that sort of failover DR. Well, that is quite interesting because my next slide is the data that we gathered from that study that we did with Actual Tech Media. So when we surveyed 300 companies, and they range between companies with 100 employees and 5,000 employees, across the board, the number one barrier to adopting Failover was cost. 36% of people said it's just too expensive. 25% of people said we didn't have the internal staff to do it, right? When you lump those two together, you got roughly 60% of the world saying, look, either for CapEx reasons or for OpEx reasons, we just can't afford it. And that's right on line with today's audience results. About 50% of you said you just can't afford Failover DR. And what we're going to talk about today is a new technology called DRaaS, or Disaster Recovery as a Service, that's going to allow you to bust through that position of not being able to afford DR. But before we talk about that, let's just take a little, zoom out a little bit and think about data protection holistically. In the 70s, tape backup emerged as sort of the leading data protection technology, and there's still a lot of it around 40 years later. Then it was disk, then cloud, then secondary site failover. But when we analyze these, today throughout the presentation, we're going to talk about RTO, RPO, right? And so this means recovery time objective, or the time it takes to get back up and running, and recovery point objective, or what's the data loss window that we might incur. So when I studied computer information systems, I was taught about data protection across these three vectors, RTO, RPO, and cost. And what you'll notice with the first four rows here is that as technology evolved over the last 40 years around data protection, we got successively better RTOs and RPOs. So if you look at tape backup, right, it's got one little bubble, so one bubble of awesome. In other words, a really lousy RTO and a really lousy RPO. Go down to secondary site failover, and it's fantastic RTO and RPO. You can failover in minutes, but the cost is astronomical. Right? So generally speaking, we've had this linear relationship between better and better RTOs and RPOs, but greater and greater costs. But if you look at this last row with DRaaS, a technology that's evolving right now and has become sort of white hot in the industry over the last 12 months, DRaaS, the promise of DRaaS is that it delivers push button failover. It delivers an RTO and RPO of minutes, but at a really low price point, a price point that's akin to tape backup, right? And this slide really sets up the rest of today's presentation. So let's now move into sort of the meat, which is the 5 must-haves of a modern disaster recovery solution. So the next 5 slides are all about what you should be thinking about as you're planning for 2016, you're planning out your disaster recovery programs and implementations. These are sort of 5 key things to be looking for, and frankly, you shouldn't have to settle for anything less than these 5 key technologies we're about to talk about. So what are these 5? The first one is you've got to find a disaster recovery solution that won't break the bank. And what I mean by that is disaster recovery, frankly, these days, should it be at roughly the same price of a backup solution, right? The days where disaster recovery was geometrically more expensive are behind us. 2, DRaaS and modern DR gives you the promise of being able to boot your infrastructure anywhere. So actually, either booting it on-prem or booting it in the cloud, whatever's appropriate for the disaster you're dealing with. 3, it's got to protect everything, right? Having siloed technology where you got one tech for laptops, another tech for physical servers, and another tech for virtual servers, that is so 2005. 4, you want to look for technology that has what we call cloud spillover technology, and I'll explain what that means. And then last, it's got to be an integrated solution, not a piecemeal solution that you jerry-rig together. And so let me show you how this would work in an ideal world, okay? So, there we go, big button, there we go. So this is sort of our initial state. We've got our end users and they're connecting to applications and servers. Let's say it's an Exchange server, they're using Outlook, they're doing their email, everything's fine. And then a disaster occurs. Now that could be a micro disaster like the motherboard on an ESX host blows, or that could be a macro disaster, like Hurricane Sandy taking out a data center. But either way, the servers and apps that this user is connecting to are down. What do? You get the call, it's 2 in the morning, your pager lights up, your whole team's awake. With DRaaS, with a modern DR solution, you should be able to log into an application, ideally cloud-based, find the servers that are dead, tell the system to then virtualize, recover, and spin up and boot those systems, and then cut your users across to the new production infrastructure and do all of that in a couple of minutes. Not days, not hours, a couple of minutes, right? Now, how is this possible? Well, traditionally, companies have used backup as a poor man's disaster recovery. And oftentimes people confuse this, right? I'd love to get audience commentary on this, but I mean, do you have a clear articulation in your head of what is the difference between backup technology and disaster recovery technology? Well, when we think about DRaaS, there's one key thing that's different over traditional backup systems. Backup systems always implicate restore. That's what's backup and restore. And restore implicates moving large amounts of data over a wire. That could be moving a lot of data off a tape. That could be moving a lot of data off a disk. That could be moving a lot of data over the internet back down to your systems. But the key thing is that when something goes bad, you usually get some new compute infrastructure, like a new server, and then recover data to it, right? With DRaaS, we do the opposite of that. With DRaaS, we leave the data where it is, either on an on-prem appliance or on an off-site appliance or up in the cloud, and we move the compute to the data. So we harness the power of the cloud, clever software, and virtualization to move compute to the data and boot almost instantly, and therefore not have to do a recovery. So we're eliminating the whole concept of recovery time. We're eliminating the whole concept of having to move mountains of data back to compute by moving the compute to the data. And that concept's key to what we're talking about here today. So when I said before, don't break the bank, we've got to first ground ourselves in sort of the traditional approach to DR. On the left, in the red bubble, let's say this is a $10,000 SQL server, right? Well, the old school approach to DR, and when I say old school, I mean up until like, say, 18 months ago, the main way consultants or tech professionals will tell you to sort of set up a best-in-class DR rig is to find a second site, the blue bubble, put in a similar amount of equipment into the second site. The amount would depend on whether this is a warm site or a hot site. And then procure bandwidth, use people and software to replicate and glue those two things together. But the problem with this hardware-centric approach to DR is it can end up costing you 3 times as much as just the production infrastructure would in the first place, right? It's expensive to implement. It's very complex to implement, test, and use. It's still not perfect with RTO and RPO. You've still got trade-offs. And it's often vulnerable to hackers. There's often security breaches implicated because those second sites are often not as secure as our production infrastructure. So this is what I said, that when you're looking for a modern DR solution, you should be looking for something where instead of 3 times the cost of your production infrastructure, you might be dealing with, say, 1.2 times the cost of your production infrastructure. So that's, pillar number 1. The second thing to look for is this ability to boot from anywhere, that talk track I have about moving the compute to the data. With DRaaS, you want to be able to boot wherever is appropriate. So let's say in your data center, you've got your Exchange server. Well, let's say you've got a VMware cluster, right? ESX 10 VMs. We're backing that up to an infrascale appliance that's sitting next to it, and that's replicating to the cloud, okay? ESX machine dies, motherboard fries. You should then be able to choose, where am I going to bring this back up? Am I going to bring this back up on the on-prem appliance? Am I going to bring this up in the cloud? Or am I going to bring this up in my other second office, right? So you've got to find a solution that supports all of those different configurations. And it should also be flexible enough to handle different resolutions of failure. So what I mean by that is you should be able to fail over a single VM, a whole VM host, like a hypervisor, or an entire office if you need to, right? Whereas a lot of DR solutions, say like a SunGuard type solution, you can only do a macro disaster declaration and fail over the entire infrastructure. Whereas what we should be able to do is just fail over what's appropriate for the disaster we're facing. So the third thing to look for then is technology that is going to protect all of your infrastructure. What do I mean by this? Well, we're poking at people that sort of promote the siloed approach. So you can go out there and you can buy a Druva, which is really good for laptop backup, and you can buy a Veeam, which is really good for VMware backup. Buy a Shadow Protect, which is good for for bare metal backup of Windows servers on metal. But that's a pretty lousy approach when you have all of those different things in your environment, right? In an ideal world, you'd buy a solution that can handle laptops, mobile devices, physical servers, and virtual servers. And there are vendors like Infrascale out there that do this. There's a few of us, right? So look for a vendor that has that broad platform support. Protect any device at 9 o'clock on the clock here. And the second thing I'd say is it's got to support all the major operating systems. So something that only supports Windows really is only going to work in a very small environment. Today, in this age, it's got to support Windows, it's got to support Hyper-V, it's got to support Unix and Linux, and it's got to support VMware. And if you're not supporting all of those, then frankly, you're still going to end up with multiple product silos. Third thing to look for when it comes to sort of this protection paradigm is how it can be deployed, right? Some vendors sell appliances, some vendors sell software. Ideally, find a vendor that can sell it to you in both formats. So at InfraScale, we sell a physical appliance or a virtual appliance. The next point, store in any cloud. This is really important. Don't pick a vendor that locks you into one particular cloud, right? You've got to make sure that you've got freedom of cloud choice. So with InfraScale, you can store data in your cloud, our cloud, or any cloud. So you've got complete cloud agnosticism. And then lastly, this point we've already hit on a couple of times, you've got to be able to boot anywhere. So when that disaster happens, you need to be able to decide where's the best place to bring my machines back up and run them. All right, so pillar number 4, exploit cloud spillover. You may not be familiar with this, but what you will be familiar with is what I call the hardware hamster wheel. This is the concept of when we're doing backup and data and frankly storage in general, we go through a pretty typical cycle. We spec some storage, we buy it from a vendor, we deploy it, we fill it up, and then we rinse and repeat. And so more space always means more appliance, and we're always buying more and more and more and more. Because the amount of data that we're storing is growing so quickly, the time between these cycles is compressing, right? And it's an untenable equation. And frankly, it just doesn't make any sense anymore. A better way is use a device that knows how to intelligently spill data out to the cloud, so that by inserting a small server into your environment that knows how to work with the cloud intelligently, you can move data in and out, and you've got this infinite elastic cloud capacity built right into your network. So make sure you've got a technology stack that implements cloud spillover when you're looking for disaster recovery solutions. And then lastly, find an integrated solution. I think, Apple has taught us in the last 10 years. I wasn't an Apple guy. I still don't think of myself as an Apple guy, but boy, did they prove one point, and that is that if you integrate hardware and software together in a well thought through solution, you get something that's dramatically more effective than if you just focus on software and someone else focuses on hardware. And the data protection industry is frankly dominated by people who only focus on one side of the equation. You've got the NetApps and EMCs and the IBMs of the world who focus on big iron and metal. You've got the Commvaults and Veeams and backup execs of the world who just focus on software. But a far better approach is to go with vendors who have integrated the hardware and the software for you and can actually sell you that complete solution. A typical laundry list of things to buy when you're building a disaster recovery and backup rig can be backup software and storage for that, disaster recovery software and separate storage for that, WAN acceleration equipment if you've got multiple locations, high-speed storage if you want to be able to virtualize and run machines quickly, replication software if you've got off-site locations. And then, of course, you've got to be MacGyver to figure out how to jury-rig all of this technology together. Again, that is something that should be behind you. You should be able to buy a solution that just works out of the box. And so with that preamble, let me tell you a little bit about us. At InfraScale, our mission is really simple. We want to eradicate downtime. We want to equip every company with the ability to quickly and affordably recover from any disaster, large and small. Going back to my example of sort of the motor car, we believe that the computing industry has been incredibly lax in its inability to solve the data protection problem, and that whilst our ability to create data has proliferated and accelerated, our ability to protect it has been relatively stagnant for decades. So we're trying to shift that up, right? And for us at InfraScale, it's a personal mission. I'll tell you 2 stories of mine that motivate me. When I was at university studying law, the end of my university years, I dropped an external hard disk drive on which I'd stored all of my notes from my entire degree. And platters broke. I took it to sort of a hard disk recovery company. I spent a few $1,000s to get it recovered. I only got about 20% of my files back. So I lost years worth of work, which I would have loved to have retained, not just for nostalgic reasons, but frankly for productivity reasons. And it wasn't just the hit in my pocket, the couple $1,000 which I didn't have as a student. It was the fact that years of my work had gone down the drain, right? And that was a terrible day in my life that I'll never forget. And I'll tell you a second terrible day in my life was in one of my first jobs out of college. I was responsible for a government IT system that supported thousands of users. And one night it was down, and I was responsible for getting it back up and running. And I didn't know if I could or when I could. And sort of the terror that I experienced that night is not something I'd wish on my worst enemy, right? So for me, I understand on a very personal level how damaging data loss and downtime can be. And when you go throughout our company, everybody's got stories like that. So this is sort of what we wake up and think about every day. And our marquee product is a product we call the Cloud Failover Appliance. What is it? It's a thin cloud edge appliance that you put into your network. It protects everything, your laptops, your physical servers, your virtual servers. Supports Windows, Linux, Unix, VMware, Hyper-V. And it integrates backup, archiving, endpoint protection, and failover services. So all the things that I talked about in that sort of 5 key things to look for. So what does it do? Well, in addition to doing your backup and archive, it gives you this ability to boot critical servers and apps from the cloud or on the appliance in the event of an outage. And what makes it cool? Well, it gives you this magic undo button. So if you're in Microsoft Word and you make a boo-boo, you can always hit Control-Z and undo. The Cloud Failover Appliance gives you the undo button for your infrastructure, right? If something goes wrong in your infrastructure, you can use the CFA to recover in seconds. And so going to the topic of not breaking the bank, InfraScale is really delivering breakthrough pricing, right? We're using the cloud and clever software instead of dumb hardware to completely change up the price performance mix of disaster recovery. We're more than 70% less expensive than, other data protection brands you might know, like a Barracuda. We're 80% less expensive than building a Commvault NetApp type solution. So dramatically more affordable, makes your budget dollars go a lot further. And what our mission here is to do is to give companies full disaster recovery, full second site failover at the price point of a tape backup solution, right? And we believe that, well, no, we have the data. We have today's audience polls. We know that the number one thing stopping people from adopting disaster recovery is price. So it wasn't enough for us to build cool technology. We had to build cool technology at a dramatically lower price point so that folks like you in the audience who wish you have DR but couldn't afford it now can get it into your budget. And so you might wonder who we compete with. Here's some of the folks who are in the industry that we come across a lot. You'll notice these are all integrated solution providers. So Veeam isn't here because they're just a software company. Zerto's not here, same thing. So these guys who are selling appliances like Axient, you may be familiar with, Datto, Barracuda, Unitrends. When you look across these different companies, the number one thing that we do, I think, that's special and that none of our competitors do is we guarantee your recovery time. So it's the last point, the last row here above 3-year cost, but it's the most important. With InfraScale, you know that you can recover your systems in 15 minutes or less, guaranteed, right? And that's incredibly important. And there are other ways that we compete against these companies. For example, we cover Unix, Linux, Windows, Hyper-V, and VMware. No one else has that sort of footprint. But I don't think any of that matters. To me, the most critical thing is that 15-minute guarantee so that you know what your worst-case scenario is. Here's a screenshot of our dashboard. We're going to see a demo here in a few minutes. But we, in addition to sort of this powerful technology, we try and make it simple to use. So single pane of glass, central management for as many locations as you have. Very powerful management system. So sort of wrapping up the presentation component, what makes us unique? Well, 4 pillars to our brand: security, simplicity, flexibility, and affordability. So we build encryption in from the ground up with double-blind encryption built in. If you don't know about what I mean by double-blind encryption, go ahead and ask me, and we'll get to that in the Q&A. Simplicity, so that we've got US-based support 24/7, fully integrated appliance with all of the hardware and software and data center operations that you need. Take it out of the box and be protected in an hour. Flexible, we support any cloud. We allow you to recover anywhere. We support any OS. We work on any device format. And affordable. 80% less expensive than the traditional enterprise disaster recovery technologies, 70% less expensive than our modern competitors, breakthrough price point. And don't take my word for it. Go to our website and read some of the resources we've got. So Gartner recently gave us their Cool Vendor and DR Award, which really pumped about. But also we're getting a lot of attention from a lot of different outlets. So recommend cruising around the resources section of our website. There's some really good stuff in there. And then last but not least, I'd encourage you to take us up on this offer we've got going. You can actually get a free eval unit. So, you know, you can read about us, you can talk to a sales engineer, but you can also get your hands on the technology. We can send you out one of these appliances, you can rack and stack it, you can use it in your network and see if it actually does everything I said and if it meets your needs. If you're interested in that, you can type into the questions tool, would like an eval, name, phone number, email address, or you can email team@infrascale.com. Okay, so folks, at this point we can do one of two things. We can either go into the Q&A session or we can do a demo. I always like to see what the audience wants to do there. So if you want me to do a demo, type demo into the Q&A, and if we don't get enough people saying that, then we'll go into the Ask Me Anything session. All right, the demos have it. So a demo it is. So what we've got here is a video that's pre-canned that I'm going to play through the GoToWebinar software. And what I'll do is I'll pause it as we go, and I'll talk over the top of it. So here on screen, this is the InfraScale dashboard. This is sort of mission control of your overall InfraScale environment. And remember, with InfraScale, you are protecting your laptops and your desktops, your physical servers, and your virtual servers. So those are the objects that we're going to protect. And using the centralized dashboard, you can log in from anywhere on any device to manage all of that, right? And so as I play this video, you'll see that there are a lot of analytics and reports and tools that you've got right in the software to allow you to see what's going on across your entire network. But today we've been talking about modern disaster recovery and cloud failover. So we're actually going to go and we're going to go to our appliances page. And here on the appliances page, you'll see a whole bunch of appliances. Basically, think of it as one appliance per office. So think about each one of these rows as one location. If you're a partner, that might be multiple clients of yours. If you're an enterprise, this might be multiple offices. If you're just a small business, you might just have a single row, right? And on the left-hand side, you've got the main appliance that would go into your data center. On the right-hand side, you've got what it's replicating to. So you can see that some of these appliances are replicating to the cloud, some others aren't replicating at all, and then some of the others are replicating to a second appliance. But what I'm going to do is actually drill into the cloud side and show you what we would do if we had that 2 a.m. call, right? So it's 2 a.m., you get the call, the data center's flooded, the server's down. So I'm going to log in here to dashboard and go across to the cloud boot tab. I'm going to find the Exchange server that's down and then click boot. This gives me a wizard that I'm going to go through. It's about a 4-step wizard. The first thing I'm going to do is pick when I want to recover that server at. Then I'm going to configure some network rules. This is where I can do network management, IP addressing, firewalling. And for the purpose of the demo, we're just going to allow remote desktop and SSH. Then I can set who I want to be notified when this machine's come up. We can put a D-list in there. In this case, I'm just putting my own email address. Then we click finish. Now, this can take anywhere from 30 seconds to a couple of minutes. Remember, 15 minutes guaranteed. In this case, because it's a VM that we've used many times, it's almost instantaneous. So we go across to the Active tab. You can see here that that Windows server is now running. And just to verify everything, we're now going to remote desktop into it, right? So again, remember, production server's dead. The metal-based Exchange server's died. We've now virtualized and spun up and brought that VM up in the cloud, and now we're RDPing in to make sure that that server's actually running. So what we're expecting as we log in is Windows Server Manager, which we've got, and obviously RDP is working because I've been able to connect, but let's make sure that other network services are working. So we're going to go ahead and ping Google. And that works. So the server's up and running. So you just saw in about a minute taking a dead server to a live server using the InfraScale Cloud Failover appliance. All right. So that's the end of the presentation, folks. We're now going to go into the Ask Me Anything. We've got a ton of questions on the line, which is terrific. Remember that we're giving away that Kindle for the person who asked the most questions. And as we go into the Q&A, I'm just going to throw up the very last poll of the day, and we'll just leave this up on the screen throughout the Q&A. And this poll is really just asking you, where is your head at, and where are you at when it comes to backup and disaster recovery. So number one, I'm not happy with my current backup system. Number two, I'm happy with my backup system, but I'm interested in your failover DR. Number three, I'm deploying some new equipment, and so, I'm looking at new protection systems. Or number four, happy with my system, just here today to learn and get some free pizza. All right, so with that, let's go to the Q&A. And bear with me as I just go back to the top of the question list, folks. Okay. So Colin asks, how does DRAS impact my data security or compliance, HIPAA, PCI, etc.? So Colin, we are HIPAA, SARbox, FINRA, and PCI compliant. Very large verticals for us is healthcare, financial services, legal, government, law enforcement. So, we take security very seriously. DRAS isn't going to compromise, your security. For example, if you're a hospital and you've got to comply with HIPAA, then we can be a HIPAA compliant solution for you. And that's important for everybody in the line is, if you're subject to any of those regulatory frameworks, make sure that the disaster recovery vendor that you pick, has that compliance factor. Jason writes, you stated that you move compute, but we find that ops spends more time on the replication issues between storage units globally than the compute platform. That's our biggest challenge. Jason, that's interesting. Yeah, so so you want to look at things like WAN acceleration over the wire deduplication to make sure that replication speed is very fast. We use both of those technologies in our solutions to make sure that the moving of the data is very, very fast. Some solutions require you to go and buy like a WAN acceleration product and put in front of it. We've built that right in. So we've actually got a patented deduplication technology that allows us to pretty dramatically reduce the data payload that gets pushed over the wire. Jason writes also, how do you handle DNS to point to the working servers? Simple round robin would be a problem. Yeah, Jason, there's a few ways to handle DNS. It's got to be implemented correctly. Managed DNS is usually what we suggest for distributed work environments, but we also support point-to-point firewalls and MPLS connections. So there's a few different ways we can handle the network failover. David writes, using the Exchange server example, how does InfraScale solve the problem of booting a VM, like an Exchange server, in the cloud and allow mail flow in and out with things like MX record changes, A records, PTR, SPF. So David, that's part of sort of implementing your holistic disaster recovery plan. Some people will leave those sorts of things to manual cut across, which we don't recommend. Others will actually set up managed DNS for failover of all of those network level items at the time of a disaster. Jason writes, can you replicate to multiple cloud services? Yes, Jason, we support Amazon, Azure, and of course InfraScale's own cloud service. David writes, is InfraScale an agent-based backup, or does it communicate with the hypervisor? So David, this is a religious issue in data protection. Some people swear by agentless, and some people swear by agent. Agentless. I don't know which one I said first, agentless versus agent-based. We support both. So what we recommend is that within the data center, you use the agentless approach and connect directly to the hypervisor. And with InfraScale, you can connect right into, an ESX host or what we're now calling vSphere. VMware's renamed everything on us, or a vCenter environment. Same thing with Hyper-V. Or, you can then install agents within those guests. We don't recommend that. But for things like, say, Unix servers or, Linux running on Metal, we've got agents there. So it's we've got both, and sometimes agents are the best approach. For example, branch offices, it's often appropriate to install an agent on those machines and back them up over the wire. Peter writes, Zen server, ? Peter, if you can expand on that question, that'd be great. I'm not sure what you mean. Okay, Jason writes, can you spin up backup domain controllers that handle DHCP and DNS services? Jason, yes, we can. Kevin writes, is the data backup real time? Kevin, the resolution of protection is configurable. So you can set it to protect you every 15 minutes or whatever resolution you want. Chris writes, Jason writes, is WAN acceleration used for cloud replication? If you fail over, does it accelerate users across the cloud server? Jason, yes, that's exactly it. David writes, how does this compare to Dell Aperture Appliance in features and cost? David, that's a good question. Aperture is a solid product. It's expensive. Since Dell bought it, they've really slowed down their pace of innovation. They don't support Unix, Linux on Metal, Hyper-V, and VMware altogether. And it's really focused on being a server-only solution. It doesn't really work for those laptops and endpoints. Okay, next question from Kevin. If you were using IaaS with Azure or Amazon, is your solution still needed? Kevin, probably. I mean, look, if you go back to, let's go all the way back to the causes of data protection, data loss. Remember, the first one was hardware failure. The second one was user error. The third one was software failure. Well, arguably, infrastructure as a service from Amazon or Azure isn't subject to hardware failure. Fine. 40% of data loss was still from software error or user error, right? And so just because you've moved from on-prem infrastructure to cloud infrastructure doesn't protect you from those things. And again, this is my sort of comment. A lot of people think disaster recovery is about sort of protecting against the biblical events, the floods and the fires. That's not the case. It's protecting against the junior sysadmin or the bash script that wasn't properly programmed. Okay, Jason also writes, what's the smallest CFA you have? We have large and small offices. Small offices have one VM server. It would be nice to have a backup option to the cloud. Jason, so for your really small offices, you might use one of our virtual appliances. That's, they're the most flexible. But our smallest device is a 1U device. It's called the CFA 1200. It's got 4 terabytes of internal storage. I'm all over the place today, folks. Okay, we've got a couple of people who are interested in that evaluation. Great. Remember, folks, if you're interested in getting one of those eval units to use on site, just type that into the questions tool. All right, Melinda writes, my problem is that the computer itself was stolen. I had a Windows image backup, but I cannot restore it to a new computer. Can you do that? Yes, Melinda, we can. That's bare metal recovery to dissimilar hardware, and we do support that. Lisa writes, can you elaborate on double-blind encryption when you have a moment? Lisa, yeah, this is important. So double-blind encryption, been around for a long time, but it's not widely adopted across the industry, and it needs to be. Double-blind encryption is this idea that you shouldn't just, so when you use Dropbox, right, you put your data into Dropbox raw, and it goes across an SSL tunnel, gets to the cloud, and then Dropbox encrypts it with a key that they manage. And that's fine for consumer-grade stuff, but for business data, it's really not fine. A better approach is to encrypt data before it leaves your computer with a key that only you know and that the vendor doesn't know. Then send it over the wire and have it landed in the data center and encrypt it again with a key that the vendor has and you don't know. And then you've got these 2 keys. So it's a bit like a safety deposit box in the bank where you have to show up with your key and the bank manager has to show up with his key. And you've both got to cooperate. By having 2 separate keys that neither party has, what you end up with this dual key custodian regime, which dramatically lowers the chances of an attack being successful. It eliminates the possibility of a rogue employee on either side getting access to data, and it means that even if a hacker or intruder gets into the data center, they can't decrypt the data because they don't have both keys. Okay, next question. From Kevin, how does the appliance throttle bandwidth usage during production times? So Kevin, there's a pretty powerful bandwidth shaping tool within it, so you can decide, how much bandwidth should it use at different times. Jason writes, can you store in different AWS regions? Jason, yeah. So when you're setting up the Cloud Failover appliance, there's actually just a drop-down that lets you choose which of the 16 infrascale locations around the world you'd like to use. That's if you're using the infrascale cloud. If you're using the Amazon cloud, then you can deploy it into any of their regions. Denise writes, how is this different from HA in VMware? Well, Denise, HA is different to DR. HA is generally concerned with real-time replication. The problem with HA is that if you muck up your production copy, right, you then generally synchronize those problems across to your secondary copy, and both of them are broken. Also, HA from VMware is very, very expensive. So with disaster recovery, what we've got is snapshots and versions, so you can roll back to any point in time. And it's also, our solution is far less expensive than VMware's disaster recovery solutions. Okay. Melinda writes, I'm a very small business, but I've got a lot of confidential information. Is this cost effective for someone? Melinda, it is. You can get started for a couple of $100 a month. All right. David writes, is the deduplicated compressed data at rest and in transit? Yes, David, it is. Nicholas writes, is Proxmox Zen supported? No, Nicholas, it's not. Colin asks, is Mac OS X supported for clients? Yes, Colin, it is. Mark writes, how do you support non-US, e.g. Australia? Mark, so the support's 24 hours a day, so you can call in, and we've got free call numbers in many countries, including Australia. So for you, you would just call a local free call number, and you'd be routed to our US call center. All right, next question is from Jeff. Can we host all the backups in our own cloud? Absolutely, Jeff. So when I said your cloud, our cloud, or any cloud, your cloud means hosting this in your cloud infrastructure. So if you've already got a second location, or if you've got a data center, you can leverage that. Sharon wrote, will you be covering pricing? So Sharon, only in the general sense that I did, that were dramatically less expensive, like 80% less expensive than the NetApp and Commvault type solutions, and 70% less expensive than Barracuda. Specific pricing configurations, I'd really recommend you get in touch with one of our sales folks who can give you a customized proposal. Mark writes, how does this seed data to DR locations? Well, Mark, you can use our WAN acceleration to push the data over the wire very quickly, or you can actually send us data on a hard disk drive and we can upload it for you. How do I get a free eval? If you would like a free eval, just type in, I would like an eval name. My name is, Ken. My email is ken@infrascale.com. My phone number is, blah, blah, blah. Okay. David writes, what changes regarding cost if a cloud backup server needs to be spun up? David, spinning up and running in the cloud is included in the pricing. Okay, Lisa writes, is there a limit on cloud storage space, and can we use a private cloud? Lisa, there's different tiers, and yes, you can use a private cloud. Mark writes, how do you size the appliances? Mark, typically just by the amount of raw data that you want to protect, and our sales engineers can work you through that. Jeff says he would like an eval unit. Jeff, close but no cigar. If you can type in, I'd like an eval unit, and then your name, email, and phone number, our team will sweep through all these questions, and they'll be in touch today. Kevin writes, does your solution integrate with Dell DR backup solutions and NetVault? No, Kevin. We're more of a replacement for that type of a solution. David writes, does the software have the capability to do long-term archive, like 7-year archival for FINRA? Yes, it does. Mark says, do you have a local Australian presence? Details? Mark, we do. We'll get in touch. Michael writes, can you back up to your own cloud like Synology? Yes, Michael, you can. And so that, folks, brings us to the end of the Q&A, which has been great. Thanks, everybody, for participating. Carla, if you can let me know who has won the Kindle for the most questions, that would be fantastic. And in the meantime, folks, just a reminder, if you didn't get a pizza, let us know. Send an email at team@infrascale.com, and we will get you a voucher. We'll send it to you tomorrow. Sometimes Domino's gets the orders mixed up. Apologies on behalf of Domino's. Secondly, remember you're going to get an email link to the video of today's presentation if you want to watch it later or share it with colleagues. Thirdly, really encourage you to get an evaluation unit, try out our technology. To do that, you can just type into the questions tool, I'd like an eval, my name, phone number, email address. And then lastly, if you've got any feedback for me, I'd love to hear from you, ken@infrascale.com. I'm always looking for ways to make these webinars more educational and more entertaining. So with that, folks, I want to thank you for your attention. And Carla is going to come on the line here, and oh no, she's actually, okay, we've got the details. So the winner is Jason. Congratulations, Jason. So we will be emailing you, Jason Hyams. Jason, we'll be emailing you to make sure we've got the right delivery address to get that prize out to you.